review them. This is Meta-Illusions and Qualia Quietism by Pete Mandik, and this is in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And as always, my first time reading it, I am not endorsing it. We're just trying to see if there's anything worthwhile here. And as always, feel free to ask questions along the way. So, Pete Mandik is strongly sympathetic with Frankish's illusionism, and if he were right to suggest the only real options regarding so-called phenomenal consciousness were radical realism about phenomenal properties and his illusionism, I would readily ally with the latter. Okay, so there's this illusionism by Frankish, and Mandik likes it. Fine. Nagel spotted already, yeah. Since it was, hey, did you get that? Oh, I did. I'm sorry. I was at work. I was like, I marked it down to respond to you, but like the person even admits that was not published work. And now that what you sent me was like interesting in terms of like paradoxes, but I didn't get a chance to look at it because I was at work, and they were like, these are just my thoughts and it's not peer reviewed. So I was like, okay, I'll get to this later then. But yeah, okie dokie. Sorry, it completely slipped my mind. I would have found it later when I was like going through my stuff. Okay, continuing with the paper. However, I don't view those two as the only appealing choices, and I don't think other views Frankish mentions prior to narrowing the field, for example, conservative realism, eliminativism, adequately describe my own favorite approach to the topic. Taking inspiration from Ray's Meta-Atheism, which instead of the view that God does not exist is the view that no one actually believes that God exists, despite their claims to the contrary, I am tempted to label my reaction to Frankish's illusionism Meta-Illusionism. The gist of Meta-Illusionism is that it rejects phenomenal realism while also insisting that no one is actually under the illusion that there are so-called phenomenal properties. One line of thought that leads me to Meta-Illusionism is that there's no content to the claim that any properties seem phenomenal to anybody. And so the term phenomenal here means usually it's just what you think is the raw data from your senses. So it says there's no properties from your raw data that seems real to anyone here. So, oh, cool. The dude is your professor. Either way, it's cool. Okay, and here my worries are almost entirely about the word phenomenal and its ilk. Yeah, so what do you mean by the phenomena that your senses give you here? Oh, George Ray, cool. The reference. Another line of thought that leads me to Meta-Illusionism hinges on the word illusion and the worry that, while there may be some people to whom it seems that there are phenomenal properties, and those, again, things that you just get from your senses, the properties there, this appearance, which I do not grant as reflecting reality, is insufficiently widespread to be worth considering an illusion, as opposed to, say, a weird belief that certain philosophically educated individuals claim to hold. Given my worries about what counts as an illusion, properly so called, I am a little reluctant to embrace the label Meta-Illusionism, since I don't want to say that the illusionists are deceived in a sufficiently systematic way to attribute them an illusion. If I needed a better label for my view, I might go with Qualia Quietism, and I'll close the current article with remarks about what that amounts to. Yeah, I'm tripping a little bit on this language here. This is not poorly written. It's just not. I feel like this is actually well written. It's just not well written to be read out loud. Like, I don't think this is like. Sometimes it's just poorly. Sometimes these papers are poorly written. This is not that. This is just definitely not been read aloud. These are long sentences and a lot of like little words in the sentences, and it's like they don't flow. It's not so bad when you're reading, but when you're reading aloud, it's kind of tough. I cannot handle the Mandik. That's exactly right, Vipers. Didn't start as a conference paper? No. Did not start as a conference paper. On Phenomenal, Section 1. One thing Frankish and I have in common is that neither of us wants to assert that there are any properties instantiated that are referred to or picked out by the phrase phenomenal properties. You see this like right here. There are no commas here or like other grammatical tools. This is just like straight one word, except for the scare quotes or the definitional quotes around phenomenal properties. If I wrote this sentence, one thing that Frankish and I have in common is that neither of us wants to assert that there are any properties instantiated that are referred to, see this, that are referred to or are picked out like there's nothing here that really picked out by the phrase phenomenal properties. This should be like, to me, this would be broken up. Like give some M dashes, give some like more commas, but there's no commas here. It's just like, it's okay to be doing it when you're writing it, but like when I'm reading out loud, I need the visual cues about where to pause and where the like the idea breaks are, and they're not here. Not 9 pages, not 9 solid pages of Mandik. No, I cannot handle 9 of Mandik. That's right. One place where Frankish and I part ways is over whether that phrase is sufficiently meaningful for there to be a worthwhile research program investigating how it comes to seem to people that their experiences instantiate any such properties. Yeah, long sentences. Like Frankish, I'm happy with terms like experience consciousness and conscious experience, and join Frankish in using what he calls weak and functional construals of such terms. But unlike Frankish, I see no use at all, not even an illusionist one, for the term phenomenal and its ilk. The term phenomenal, as is used in contemporary philosophy of mind, is a technical term. I am aware of no non-technical English word or phrase that is accepted as its direct analog. Unlike technical terms in math and physics, which are introduced with explicit definitions, phenomenal has no such definition. And note, I tried to give one before. Granted, that is a technical definition given in 20th century analytic philosophy. So there's phenomenal, those are you have direct access to like whatever your senses give you. And then there's phenomenological, which would mean the senses give a more complicated sort of structure to things in the world. And so it's like the logical, like the phenomenological indicates there's more structure to it. Phenomenal means you're just getting like the properties indirectly. So this is an older distinction in 20th century analytic philosophy. I get this from Wittgenstein, but like, and it's also in Heidegger for some stuff too. So it's not like an unused thing, but like it's always a technical thing. So Mandik is correct here, but like I'm trying to say what I was defining. Bonafish, same minute. Yeah. Okay. With what we find instead of an explicit definition are other technical terms treated as interchangeable synonyms. Frankish follows a common practice in philosophy of mind where he treats phenomenal as interchangeable with, for instance, qualitative or, in scary quotes, feely. Hey, what's up, Tindarios? As used in the relevant philosophy of mind context, qualitative doesn't mean simply relating to qualities, since properties and qualities are one and the same, and the technical term is supposed to pick out some special kind of property, a property distinctive of conscious experience. The technical term qualitative also does not seem to mean characterizing in ways other than quantity, which if it did would at least have the virtue of relating it to a non-technical use, but would lose its claim to pick out something specific to conscious experience. I'm doing okay, Tindarius. I'm doing okay. Luminance says also the meaning of phenomenological isn't quite the same between analytic and continental. That's true too. Yeah. So I'm more on the analytic side of this, which makes me closer to this paper here. But like again, phenomenological can be very specific in certain continental philosophies, which this paper is not talking about. Trouble arises for feely, which, as the scare quotes seem to warn, is not to be equated with non-technical uses of feel and its cognates, which pertain to feeling temperatures and textures, but decidedly not to, for example, what differentiates seeing blue from seeing green. And you see, these are like seeing blue and seeing green. So it's like you've got these two things here, and like you just get the property of the blue that you see. And that's kind of like the phenomenological thing they're talking about here. These three terms, phenomenal, qualitative, and feely, form a tight circle conveying little to no information to the meta-illusionist, demanding to know what it is that the illusionist thinks people are under the illusion of. One phrase that might seem to break us out of the circle of technical terms is a phrase like something it's like for the non-technical use of what it's like. And phenomenal properties are supposed to be those properties in virtue of which there is something it's like to have experiences. However, to my knowledge, the syntactic transformation of what it's like to there is something it's like only occurs in technical philosophy of mind contexts. This makes me doubt that non-technical uses of what it's like, which sometimes but not always are employed to pick out mental states, are employed to pick out a peculiar kind of property of mental states. Luminance, what's analytic? Okay, you're asking Luminance that. Carnap is not what I mean by analytic phenomenology. I mean, the only thing you're going to do is you're going to be separating it from, like, you're going to be talking about this philosophy of mind stuff is what is more analytic phenomenology here. So like this sort of stuff where they're talking about the things that the mind, the raw data that the mind gets, that's the analytic stuff. The Continentals have slightly different versions. Yeah. Lumen says there's no analytic movements as far as I know, but there's terms to describe first-person experiences. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. With when we're talking about phenomenology here, they're just talking, well, like what it's like to see blue. It's a very sort of direct phenomenology here. Or it's really phenomenal. Describing first-person experiences is like Carnap. That's fair, but it's not going to be only Carnapian in this other stuff. Yeah, well, like visual space, that's also in Wittgenstein, so that's where I was going back. And so it's like, it's not, yeah, it gets a bit more complicated. It's not just Carnap. Okay. But like, yeah, that is part of it in some sense. You do want to say, like, there's a cool, like, diagram in the Tractatus where Wittgenstein is describing the visual field. And so there's a visual field, and you can say, okay, that is kind of his phenomenology of what our experience is like. Yeah. You have a Carnapian friend who wrote a blog post on formal phenomenology. That's cool. Like, that's cool. But that's only one version of this stuff. And so you need to, like, look at the philosophy of mind. Well, see, the issue here is, Yovko, that stuff is cool, but like this is more contemporary philosophy of mind. So if we don't want to attribute like the contemporary stuff back to Carnap, that's not going to match up at the moment. But like yes, but like yeah, and Carnap did work with Husserl actually. Yeah, that's right. So okay, where were we? Okay. Yeah, so we're talking about like peculiar kinds of properties of mental states. That's what's going on here. When, for example, pop stars sing about knowing what it's like to fall in love, they give little evidence of attributing so-called phenomenal properties as opposed to whatever other properties a meta-illusionist can readily grant are seemingly instantiated by love states. The hyphenated what it's like in Frankish's what it's like properties is yet another technical term shedding no light on the term phenomenal. We have then, in place of an explicit definition of phenomenal properties, a certain chain of interchangeable technical terms. Okay, right here, this is, a little bit of history here, and Pete Mandik writing a, it's not really a history, a little bit of history, but really this is sort of like a meta argument that all the uses Pete Mandik knows are all technical terms. Does this cover all uses of these terms? Of course not. These are all uses that Pete Mandik knows and is willing to cover in this paper. This is not a full linguistic analysis. Like, we're not going through all the uses. It's not like going through all the historical text of how these terms have been used in the last 200 years. So we're just going to have to accept it, which is okay, because just you have to think of the strategy of what's going on here. Can any of you also think of any other uses of these terms? And I guess maybe in philosophy of mind is what we're talking about. So can we find any use of these terms with respect to philosophy of mind, not like continental philosophy, which will be different? What does Sabrina Carpenter know of the hard problem of consciousness? Asks Unreal Brian. That's a great question. She might know a lot. I don't know. I haven't asked her. Okay. So Mandik continues. We have then, in place of an explicit definition of phenomenal properties, a circular chain of interchangeable technical terms, containing very few links and little to relate to those links to non-technical terminology. The circle then is vicious. I'm skeptical that any properties seem phenomenal to anyone because this vicious circle gives me very little idea of what seeming phenomenal would be. Yeah. So the question is, what is it to actually have an experience, and how do you define that in a non-circular way? Okay, so I mean, to bring up this sort of like pseudo history about what Mandik knows is enough to motivate this question. And see, I can criticize like his, maybe the scope of what he has covered, but in terms of a motivation to ask this question, it's okay. Like, it raises this question, that like this question needs an answer. So it's all right in some sense that like I'm criticizing his argumentation up here, but really in service of asking this question right here, it's not bad. Okay. One way out of the vicious circle that seems unavailable to Frankish is a kind of deferential ostentation, so pointing at something. Radical realists can, without pangs of conscience, attempt to convey what they're talking about by inviting an act of inner ostentation. They invite us to look inward and appreciate that they are talking about properties like that. So yeah, so you can say, you think about your own experience. Look into yourself and think about your kind of experience. And that is what I'm talking about. And so you can see here, they finally used a grammatical thing, a little bit of emphasis on that, because we're not talking about like me actually pointing at anything, but I'm saying look into yourself. Since they think there are such properties, they aren't failing by their own lights to specify what they are talking about. They may nonetheless be failing, and that refers to nothing, but they would not be failing by their own lights. Illusionists, in contrast, are in a worse position, since by their own lights there are no such instantiated properties to inwardly point at. Since they hold instantiated phenomenal properties to be merely notional, they may attempt to gesture toward what they would be if there were any by some indirect route, perhaps via description, whatever it is that radical realists are talking about. Okay, so you can only refer to like your experiences of like the world by saying what the realists are talking about, but you can't talk about them because you're just like, there's nothing there that's just not a technical definition. However, the very real possibility arises that the radical realists aren't all talking about the same thing, given the lack of any explicit definition of phenomenal property that they agree on. Echoing Wittgenstein, each radical realist labels the private contents of their beetle box a beetle, but for all anyone knows, each box may contain something different from the others, or even nothing at all. Yeah, so this is the old, what I call green, you might call blue, or it might appear blue to you, in your experience, what I call green. But we just have different names for it, so it's no big deal. And so what are you pointing to? It may not all be the same thing, and so what we call like a phenomenal property, it may be something, it may not exist, or it may not be what we think it is. The problem I pose for Frankish is a problem of content. Yeah, again, what are we actually looking at? Like, what are we calling blue? Is that my blue, your blue? Yep, exactly. Duck, rabbit. Do you see a duck or do you see a rabbit? Exactly, semiotics. But it is not the problem of content that he himself addresses in section 3.4 of the target article. There he considers the problem of what would fix the content of the introspective representations of phenomenal properties, given that there aren't any phenomenal properties instantiated. He appreciates that the illusionist will not be able to employ any psychosemantics that rely on positioning relations, causal or other, between representations and actually instantiated properties accurately represented. The challenge I pose for Frankish is not the challenge of giving an account how such representations get their content. The challenge I pose is instead to articulate what the content is. Again, what is the color experience you're experiencing, not just what you're saying about it, not how you're talking about it, but what is that blue that I see that maybe you don't see, or that you claim is blue, but how do you know what that is? It's just what you call it by blue. Okay, the contrast between the two challenges might be illustrated via the following analogy. The theory of content challenge is to explain how a representation of cows comes to be a representation of cows and not of horses, and not of the disjunction cow or horse, and so on. My challenge, the articulation challenge, is to say what some target representation represents, to say that it represents cows, or instead represents horses, or some disjunction, and so on. I want to ask of the representations that Frankish alleges to be illusory, what are they representations of? The technical term circle, phenomenal property, qualitative property, feely property, what it's like properly, quail does nothing to answer this question, the question. Maybe a radical realist may feel confident that the term in the circle are informative, picking out as they allege some inner ostended property, but how can one sympathetic to either illusionism or meta-illusionism gain any satisfaction here? You're going to sleep? Bye-bye. Have a good night, UFCO. Thanks for stopping by. Yep. Sorry about my time zone. I know people not in the Americas not great for. Unless, maybe if you're in Australia, I don't know what time it is there. Like something far, far away. Yeah, so, okay, so imagine we have no way of actually describing our experiential feels, like what it feels like or what, like the colors or the phenomenal things there. There is nothing there. There is no, like, property there outside of, like, defining it as such. Okay, fine. But then how do you actually talk about what it is? There is nothing there. You can talk about things in the world. You don't talk about your experience of the things in the world because you're kind of making that up is what's going on here. Think it's early in the morning? Yeah. Okay. Regarding illusions. Yeah, so is Qualia, like the experience of like blue in the world, is that just something where is illusory, or is there any content to it? Of course we can talk about it. That's not the problem. The question is, what is there at all? All right. So far, I've been focusing on a circle of technical synonyms for the technical term phenomenal property. To be fair, Frankish does give other characterizations of phenomenal properties, characterizations that might break us out of the circle described above. So you can see, when I was saying earlier that Mandik, the author, gave only a limited number of stuff, he recognizes there's other ones, and maybe we could talk about them. Mandik continues, the author continues, however, these other characterizations introduce other problems for Frankish's illusionism. Frankish sometimes characterizes phenomenal properties as anomalous. Yeah, that's one of these words that you don't want to break up into multiple lines. Anomalous, yep. And other times as magical. There are other characterizations that come up as well in Frankish's article, for example, simple, intrinsic, but I will focus on just magical and anomalous for simplicity's sake. You wish Ivan was here? Yeah, he'd be very angry. Well, actually, he wouldn't be angry with the article, he might be angry with me, but that's fair, because he'd be saying, look, all this like stuff you're talking about, like mind stuff, it's nonsense, you just talk about the processing. He quite likes these arguments about saying, well, what is more to it than just all the things the brain's doing. So he identifies them as an illusionist, I believe. Okay, that's interesting, because maybe he would be swayed by some of these arguments that like illusionism is just that maybe he would go from illusionism to meta-illusionism. He likes Frankish's work. Okay, cool. Yeah, so the issue here isn't so much that Frankish is wrong, it's that maybe it shouldn't be described in the way Frankish is doing. So it should be the meta-illusionism, not the illusionism. Okay. Which is not that far off. So yeah. Okay. So what these characterizations, including in characterizations besides magical and anomalous, have in common is that they, 1, give some hope of at least partially breaking out of this circle of technical terms I complained about in the previous section. 2, they characterize properties in such a way that motivates illusionism along the lines spelled out in section 2.3 of the target article. But 3, as I'll argue below, problems arise for the claim that the false appearances in question are illusions, properly so called. Perhaps Frankish is not employing technical senses of either anomalous or magical, so there's hope here of breaking out of the vicious circle of technical synonyms, and to give an informative, though perhaps partial, answer to the question of what so-called phenomenal representations are representations of. On the partial account now being scouted, they would be, if actually instantiated, properties of experiences that are anomalous or magical. The worry I want to raise now is whether it seems to people in a sufficiently systematic way that their experiences have anomalous or magical properties. If it only seems this way to a few people versed in certain moves internal to the philosophy of mind, then this erroneous appearance seems ill-described as an illusion. It's like, yeah. So, I mean, do you have to be brought into like philosophy of mind, and then all of a sudden you start describing it like an illusion because, well, that's just part of how you talk about stuff at this point. Illusions, properly so called, occur in systematic ways for large members of the population. For example, it's very easy to find people prone to the visual illusion of a Muller lyre. For many people, certain line pairs seem of unequal length when in reality they are equal. Switching examples, people exposed to the Monty Hall problem give the wrong answer with such high frequency that it's worth perhaps calling it a cognitive illusion. Yes, people do call it that. To be clear, I'm not claiming that in order for something to be an illusion properly so called, a large number of people have to actually have undergone the illusion. Suppose very few people have seen the Muller lyre figures or have been exposed to the Monty Hall problem. Nonetheless, in these cases, there is an easily conveyed stimulus or scenario that, when presented to people, readily elicits a false appearance in many of those so presented. There's something systematic to these false appearances that makes them illusions as opposed to mere false appearances. Examples of false appearances that lack this requisite systematicity include many examples of run-of-the-mill false belief. Last Wednesday, George believed his keys were in his briefcase when in reality he had left them on his desk. In some sense of appearance, it appeared to George that his keys were in his briefcase, but his false representation of the key's whereabouts is not part of a larger pattern of eliciting conditions and responses that make it rise to the level of illusion. The example of George's false belief is one that involves only a single person. However, being held by many people is not a sufficient condition for a false representation to be an illusion. Many people have held erroneously that 1 is a prime number and that Christopher Columbus was the first European to arrive in the Americas. But these false representations aren't illusions either. That there isn't in these cases an easily conveyed scenario or stimulus that reliably elicits a false appearance. Again, this writing is kind of killing me. But what's up, Frank? Aw. Yeah. I mean, sure. So illusions aren't just lots of people being wrong about something. It's going to be, people are going to, when presented with it, systematically get it wrong. Let us temporarily leave aside the topic of whether conscious experiences seem to have anomalous or magical properties and ask about apparent anomalousness or apparent magicalness more generally. Perhaps if we have a better handle on what such appearances are generally, we may find ourselves in a better position to assess the claim that conscious experiences systematically appear to have anomalous or magical properties. Latvian Jesus says, I love highly dense academic discussions about generic mundane-ass things, such as writing 5 pages about the illusions of losing your keys. Yeah. I mean, this is like a fair thing to be said here. Like, this paper is short anyway, and it seems like it's... the paper's not long, and it seems like it's already wasting time giving examples on, that are like a little bit too long and a little bit not needed. Granted, the style of this paper, which I mentioned earlier, it's an interesting style because they're going case by case. And a lot of philosophers don't do this because it's kind of dangerous. You just don't get... You get very minimal results. Now, before, when they were going case by case, like, I don't know about this, I don't know about that, I don't know about this. Well, that they use that, like, all these things they didn't know, even though there's a lot more stuff that they could have talked about, to motivate, like, a question, like, well, what is going on in this area if you can't, like, these, like, obvious, like, definitions don't hold up. But then they're keeping doing this strategy of writing philosophy. And it's kind of interesting that, like, this is just kind of how they write. They go over case after case after case. So it's like, yeah, it's highly analytic. Yeah. Could have been succincter. Yes. Could have been succincter. Yes. So, but it's just, it's interesting. You just people generally don't write like this. And it's not a problem. It's just a little bit unusual. That's all. Just kind of hammering. You kind of feel like you're getting worn down, like they're beating you down with examples. And that is a legitimate way to argue in some sense. It's effective. I don't know if it's legitimate, but it's definitely an effective way to do stuff. Okay. Consider some impressive display performed by a professional magician. Suppose a ball is presented on a table surface and then seemingly covered up with an opaque cup. The cup is then lifted and the ball is no longer where it was last seen and the cup appears empty. Audiences delight in such displays and it seems natural to describe them as apparently anomalous or magical, and such appearances arise even for audience members who don't believe that anything actually anomalous or magical occurred. Succincter a barely sphincter, yes. Despite the belief that nothing out of the ordinary occurred, there is nonetheless a reliably generable appearance of something out of the ordinary, a ball visible in one location and then no longer visible in that location without being seen to have been removed, and also without any visibly obvious means by which it may have been moved while unseen. The reliability with which the magicians can elicit such responses from audience members across a wide variety of audience members makes it worth calling such inaccurate appearances illusions. Luhmann says, I guess because a quietist can't make positive arguments, they have to use examples to pull apart the positive theories. Giggity. Yeah. I wouldn't say that, Luminance. You can always make arguments. You can show contradictions, show that it doesn't make sense in certain ways. The fact that they showed the definitions to be circular before isn't really just using examples. They could have just defined everything and showed it to be like circular by formal means too. They didn't choose to do that, but they could have done that. Yeah, Latvian says a deep metaphysical analysis when a cucumber becomes a pickle. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Lumen says, totally, but I meant that as like a negative argument rather than make a positive claim about how the world is. Okay, yeah. I mean, that is a strategy here. It's like, sure. Okay, now let us return to the way our own conscious experience seemed to us. That a wide variety of people have conscious experience, again, in the weak and functional sense of conscious experience that the illusionist will grant, is not something I'm calling into question. Yeah, see, this is the issue here. It's not that we have experiences. That's okay here. The claim isn't that strong or that big. It's just like, okay, we all have these experiences. Nor do I intend to raise any doubts about whether those conscious experiences appear to people in various ways. For example, when someone is in a position to answer the question of whether they saw or instead felt that a piece of metal is hot, I don't mind chalking this up to the way their experience of the metal seemed to them. It seemed to them, for example, that they had a tactile experience as opposed to a visual experience of the metal's hotness. But what I have doubts is about whether people unfamiliar with the contemporary philosophy of mind introspect their conscious experiences and find them to be seemingly have properties that are anomalous or magical. Suppose one is seeing some expanse of green and also seems to oneself to be seeing an expanse of green. What anomalous or magical properties are apparently revealed to introspection? In the sense anomalous and magical that we would cash out these terms of being out of the ordinary or being contrary to the laws of nature, speaking for myself, my introspective experiences never appear that way. For example, when it seems to me that I'm having a visual experience of green, it doesn't also seem to me that my experience has properties that violate the laws of nature. See, this is a weird one. This is leaning on like what it is to be magical as to violate the laws of nature, which is not a bad definition of like magic, but anomalous. Now, say you have some sort of like green or whatever, like say silver, like this is silver here, like maybe whatever this like sort of aqua green is here. So you have that experience of that color. Could you call that like anomalous? In the very weak sense that like you normally don't see that like sort of splotch of color, it is out of the ordinary. Now, seeing that color is not like weird. That is one of the colors you can see, whatever color it is. But you might say, well, seeing it right there at this time, that's not anomalous, it's just this experience. But like, what is the thing here? Now, you really need it for there to be an illusion. You'd have to say it was more than that. And I think that's the point Mandik is trying to make here, is that we have unique experiences, but we have many unique experiences and they're not out of the ordinary. They're just unique in terms of we have lots of unique experiences. Okay. Perhaps the apparent anomalousness or magicalness isn't supposed by the illusionist to arise in ordinary episodes of introspection, but instead on occasions of reflection when one contemplates a sort of topics connected to philosophical discussions of alleged explanatory gaps between conscious experience and neurofunctional states. Perhaps the story is supposed to go like this. One intends to say a visual experience of a vivid electric blue while also contemplating the brain processes that the experience is allegedly identical to or explainable in terms of, and that the alleged fact of one arising out of being identical to or explainable in terms of the other, that seems magical or anomalous. Yeah, like, so how did you see this green right here? Is that magic to you? But what's the sense of magical or anomalous at play here? It's unlikely to be some construal in terms of being out of the ordinary or contrary to the laws of nature. What we have here is the ordinary and lawful way in which visual experiences of vivid blue arise. They arise ordinarily in connection with the activities of human brains and probably also the activities of many of the brains of non-human animals. Further and more to the point, it is not part of our introspective contents that such experiences don't arise in this manner. Our experiences do not generally present themselves to introspection, as opposed to comparatively more complex episodes involving theoretically sophisticated reflection, as the sorts of things that do not or cannot arise in virtue of neural processes. Yeah, I mean, if you can see color, or even if you can't see color, you say you're colorblind, the fact that you can like have experiences of like visual things is not anomalous. If you can see color, then yeah, you can see different colors. That is not anomalous. It's not magical. Now, if you want to say, okay, how did that happen? That's maybe a magical process in your mind. It's like, yeah, but like that's not what we really mean by magic. It may be amazing, but it's not magical. That's just how we live. Okay. Author continues, of course, there are many in the philosophy of mind who have wondered how and why it is that experiences so arise, and some philosophers have also been tempted toward the conclusion that no satisfying explanation of how and why can be given. But appreciating these philosophical questions and positions and feeling any pull one way or another regarding them seems to require far more philosophical sophistication than sits well with any apparent anomalous or magicalness being illusions properly so called. An anomalousness or magicalness being illusions properly so called. Even if the problems I tried to pose in the present section turned out to not be genuine problems for Frankish's illusionism, the problems raised in the previous section may still loom large. This is because the characterizations of phenomenal properties as anomalous or magical seem partial at best. It is unlikely that anyone who thinks that there is content to the phrase phenomenal properties of experience will accept that a property of experience is phenomenal if and only if it is anomalous or magical. I take similar remarks to apply to other characterizations of the phenomenal that Frankish employs, such as intrinsic. Okay, and so here we finally get to the answer to what's going on in this paper. 3. Qualia Quietism. And this is it. You get these 2 paragraphs. That's it. Author has expressed doubt that anyone undergoes an illusion properly so called that experiences instantiate phenomenal properties. Some of my doubts hinge on skepticism about representations having phenomenal content. Other of my doubts hinge on reservations about what properly counts as an illusion. Given the latter sort of doubt, I'm reluctant to attribute to Finkish a meta-illusion, the illusion that anyone is undergoing the illusion of phenomenal properties. I'm likewise reluctant to embrace the label of Meta-Illusionism. More appealing to me is to recommend Qualia Quietism, which we may characterize as the view that the term qualia, phenomenal properties, etc., lacks sufficient content for anything informative to be said in either affirming or denying their existence. Affirming the existence of what? Denying the existence of what? Maintaining as illusory a representation of what? No comment, no comment, no comment. This is not to assert that the field of consciousness studies is pure folly. As Frankish stresses, there are plenty of clear uses of conscious experience and conscious experience, uses that can be explicated in weak and functional ways. And there's plenty of work already done and still being done on consciousness so construed. But I see no future, illusionist or realist, for the term qualia and its ilk. Yeah, bars. Okay, and that's that for this. Yeah, I know this was a little bit analytic-y hardcore, but that's all right. This is all right. What we do is we now get to rate it, and you get to tell me how you felt about this. So, if you thought this was fun and made your brain dance, give it a brain dance. Spelling and capitalization do matter here. If you thought this had some existential or artistic or social drama to it, nog scream. Nog Oro for deep ancient ideas for the Ouroboros. Nog Knife, slicing and dicing arguments. Nog Navel, navel gazing only for academics. Nog Turd, all style no substance, still poop underneath. And Nog Rapes for big claims that shrivel up. You can also use the global vote yay and vote nay of Twitch, and my vote meh. Note that anything in the green, like here, will make I calculate an overall score. That'll make the overall score go up. Anything in the red will make the overall score go down, and the vote meh will actually move everything into the middle. So Luminance gave it a yay and a knife. Yeah, I mean, this was presenting arguments of some sort. Socknow gave it a meh. Watcher of Games gave it a yay. Thank you for the ratings. Yeah, I feel like this paper is okay. Like, it's an okay paper. This is kind of navel-gazy to me. It's like, now maybe that's unfair because more people outside than just in philosophy of mind know about qualia now. Like, the cognitive scientists are worried about these sorts of things. But like, for me, this was like, okay, we're talking about the definition of illusionism or versus meta-illusionism versus not saying anything about this stuff because we just have these formal definitions that go into it and it's not anything we can actually point to. I feel that's like a little bit, it's like a good argument. It's just, is this the best way to actually continue the research? This is one of those like, are these terms really just stand-ins for something we're going to get in the future? And then we're going to say, okay, this is what we should have been saying. Now, does that actually help us to say, well, we should have just been quietist about it because we were wrong now? We're wrong about a lot of stuff now. Does that mean we should shut up about all the things we're not exactly right about? I don't know. That's kind of my problem here, is that this style of argumentation is weak. You can motivate the problem that say, look, we have to be able to, like, define stuff better. Sure, that's great. But the question then is, well, so what if we're in sort of a illusionist area? Meta-illusionist area, where we're saying things we know aren't quite right, but we need to investigate this stuff to figure out what to say anyway. And I feel a little bit like this is and on that line, this is a little bit like philosophers telling other people what to do, which maybe is right. But I don't know if it was argued for in this paper, where it's like, okay, you guys shouldn't be talking about qualia. It's like, all right, yeah, because it doesn't make sense. Is that actually going to help the philosophers of mind? Is that going to help the neuroscientists to actually continue their research? I don't know. And that's a pragmatic question that's separate from this. Now, it's theoretically, I think Mandik made a decent argument. Is it actually good, though, in this case? I'm not sure. Lumen says, in a certain sense, I think is what we were talking about earlier with identifying dead ends. Qualia is ultimately a nonsense term. In that sense, we should drop both sides of the discussion. Yeah. Lumen says, the only analytic paper I've ever recommended and it got the worst response, not what I would have expected. Yeah. It's not bad, though. It's like, it's not a bad analytic paper. It's like, what am I going to say? It's just, also, when, like, you're in your area, sometimes you're a little harder on stuff than maybe you should be. Like, I don't think it was bad. Like, I'm kind of with Tindarius. It's like a yay and a navel gazing. So it's like, I'm going to do the vote yay. I'm also going to give it a nog navel. And then I'm going to give it a nog knife, too. Like, that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't know if it was still poop underneath. Wouldn't go that far, but like, it's just sort of like an okay paper. And, cause like, I'm just like, it makes me kind of uncomfortable. It sounds a little patronizing. It's like, oh, you guys didn't get your definitions right. And I can't figure out how to do it. It's like, well, this is a negative argument. Is there just better stuff to be using? No. And that's the problem, Chocolate Mints. I don't quite know what we should be using. And maybe, the author here is correct. Maybe we should just drop all these things. I am actually on the side of the author. I think we should probably never talk about qualia ever again. That's not a good argument, though. Like, we need something else to be doing. And the author says, well, okay, you can talk about experience and conscious experience. All right, but how else? But that's a very sort of general term. And they didn't offer anything along those lines. Granted, the short paper, they didn't have to. But, like, again, it's like, well, all right, well, what else is there to be done? Tindera says, I just meant there's a lot of name calling and style. Yep, fair. Luminant says, I don't think it will help neuroscientists, but as someone who completely agrees on the quality doesn't make sense part, I think philosophy of mind does need to get out of the circle to go forward. Okay. So it's like, this is just, I mean, I'm with you on this stuff. Not that there's no substance or that is BS. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Like, you can still rate it for those qualities, Tinderas. Yeah. Fair rating. It's like, yeah, maybe I would have just been a little bit happier if, I mean, where was this published? Where was it? This Journal of Consciousness Studies. Yeah, you know, it's like, this is fine, actually. It's like, it's not a bad paper. It's like, I didn't give it a bad rating. Like, I didn't. It was a good rating. It's just, I'm being a little critical of it. But like, you know, my rating is mostly positive on this. So it's like, yeah.